People like to say that blood is the simplest thing in the world. 2 vials, a lab, a few weeks of waiting, and then a printout with percentages on it, as if an entire life could be reduced to a pie chart. I used to believe that too. I believed it right up until the afternoon I opened an email with the subject line, "Your DNA results are ready," standing in my kitchen with a dish towel still in my hand, and watched 38 years of certainty folded on itself in under 30 seconds. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. My name is Emma Colson. I'm a labor and delivery nurse at a hospital just outside Cleveland, Ohio, and until 8 months ago, I believed I knew exactly where I came from. I believed I knew who my father was. I believed I understood the shape of my own history the way you understand the shape of your own hand, without needing to look at it twice. I was wrong about almost all of it. Finding out how wrong cost me the version of my marriage I thought was solid ground, introduced me to a family that resented me before they had ever met me, and eventually, after months of lawyers and depositions and one devastating conversation with my mother at her kitchen table, left me with $35 million I never asked for, tied to a father I first met standing in front of his own headstone. This is that story. I should say, before any of it, that I never thought of myself as someone whose life needed rearranging. Daniel and I had been married 11 years by the time this started, and if you'd asked me that January what I would have changed about my life, I would have said almost nothing. We bought a modest 3-bedroom in Parma 9 years earlier, the kind of house with a crooked garage door and a porch that needed repainting every other summer, and we'd raised Caleb in it the way most people raise a first child, learning as we went, making mistakes, correcting course. Daniel worked in logistics for a regional trucking company, steady hours, decent benefits, nothing glamorous. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital when we needed to get ahead on the mortgage. We weren't struggling, but we weren't cushioned either. We were the kind of family where a broken furnace in February meant careful conversations about the credit card, and a good year meant a week at a rented cabin near Lake Erie instead of a week at home. I tell you all of that not because it matters to the money, but because it matters to understanding who I was standing in that kitchen the day everything started to come apart. I wasn't a woman looking for a windfall. I wasn't harboring some secret suspicion about my father that a DNA test would finally confirm. I was a nurse who had signed a consent form to help her sick son, half paying attention, thinking about school pickup, and whether we had enough milk in the fridge. The unraveling that followed didn't begin with me wanting anything. It began with me simply trying to find out why my little boy couldn't stay awake through dinner. I need to start with my son, because without him, none of the rest of it happens. It's strange, looking back now, how much of what shaped my adult life traces to a single afternoon in a pediatrician's waiting room, flipping through a magazine I never actually read while a nurse called other families back one by one, waiting for someone to finally take our concerns as seriously as I already did. I remember thinking, that day, that whatever was wrong with Caleb would be the hardest part of that year. I had no idea it was only the first thread in a much longer, much stranger unraveling. Caleb was 5 years old when the fatigue started. Not ordinary 5-year-old tiredness, not the kind that comes from skipping a nap. This was different. He would fall asleep at the kitchen table with a spoon still in his hand. He would come home from half a day of kindergarten and sleep for 4 hours straight, and even then wake up gray around the mouth, complaining that his legs hurt in a way he didn't have words for. My husband, Daniel, kept saying he was probably just going through a growth spurt. I was a nurse. I knew better than to let it go, and I also knew better than to let myself think the worst before I had any real reason to. We started with a pediatrician, who ran basic blood work and found nothing alarming enough to explain what we were describing. Then we moved to a specialist, then to a second specialist, then to a geneticist at a children's hospital in Columbus who sat across from us in a small beige office and said the word mitochondrial in a tone that made my stomach drop before I even understood what it meant. She explained, carefully, that some of what Caleb was showing could point to a metabolic disorder that runs in families, the kind that doesn't always show up clearly unless you look at the full genetic picture. She wanted expanded panels. She wanted samples not just from Caleb, but from Daniel and from me, so they could trace where any relevant mutation might have originated and how it might behave as Caleb got older. I remember sitting in the car afterward in the parking garage, Daniel's hand resting on the gear shift, neither of us turning the key. "They want to test us too," I said, mostly to hear it out loud, to see where it came from. Daniel nodded slowly. He wasn't worried about what they'd find in him. Neither was I. I assumed, the way you assume the sun will rise, that my results would simply confirm what I already knew about myself and give the doctors one more data point to work with. I had no idea I was about to hand a stranger the loose thread that would unravel my entire life. The testing company the hospital used offered an optional add-on, a broader ancestry and relative matching service layered on top of the medical panel, meant to help identify extended family members who might carry the same mutation and could be quietly, usefully tested. The geneticist recommended it. More data points, she said, meant a clearer picture for Caleb's treatment plan going forward. I signed the consent form without reading every line, the way you do when a doctor hands you a clipboard and your child is the one you're actually thinking about. The medical results came back first, 4 weeks later. Caleb did carry a mutation consistent with a rare, manageable form of the disorder the geneticist had suspected, something with a treatment plan and a name I had to practice saying out loud before I could say it to my mother without stumbling. I cried in the hospital parking lot from relief as much as fear, because manageable was a word I could work with. Daniel's results showed he wasn't a carrier of the relevant gene at all, which the geneticist said was expected and unremarkable, since the mutation could easily have come from my side alone. My own results took another 10 days. When the notification came through, I was standing at my kitchen island wiping down the counter after dinner, Caleb doing homework at the table behind me, Daniel in the next room with the television murmuring low. I opened the app on my phone expecting confirmation, expecting a straightforward accounting of what I already knew about my body. What I got instead was a message from the lab's genetic counselor, requesting a phone call at my earliest convenience regarding an unexpected finding in my relative matching results. I called her back within the hour, sitting in my parked car in the driveway, because I didn't want Caleb to hear whatever was coming. Her name was Priya, and she had the calm, over-rehearsed gentleness of someone who delivers difficult news for a living. She told me that my DNA sample showed no genetic relationship to the man listed in my intake form as my father, Robert Coulson. None. Not a partial match. Not something explainable by a lab error, but a complete absence of the kind of shared markers you would expect between a parent and biological child. I sat in that car for a long time after we hung up. The porch light came on automatically as the sky darkened, and I watched moths circle it, and I thought about my father, the man I had always called my father, Robert Coulson, who had died of a heart attack when I was 26, who had taught me to drive on empty church parking lots on Sunday afternoons, who had walked me down the aisle at my wedding to Daniel 11 years earlier with his hand shaking slightly on my arm because he cried at everything, even happy things, especially happy things. The man whose face I could still see clearly enough to draw from memory. Not my biological father. Not according to the lab. Not according to science that doesn't care how many Sunday afternoons you logged in a parking lot. I didn't tell Daniel that night. I told him the results had come back fine, that I wasn't a carrier of anything unexpected, which was technically half true and entirely a lie by omission. I needed to understand what I was looking at before I said it out loud to another living person, because saying it out loud would make it real in a way that sitting alone with it in my car had not yet made it. My mother, Carol, still lived in the house I grew up in, 40 minutes north, a small brick ranch with a garden she'd kept immaculate since before I could remember. I drove there on a Saturday morning while Daniel took Caleb to a birthday party, and I sat across from her at the same kitchen table where she'd helped me with fractions in 4th grade, and I told her what the lab had found. I watched her face while I said it, and I understood, within the first 3 seconds, that she wasn't surprised. She was caught. Those are very different expressions, and I had spent 13 years learning the difference on other people's faces in hospital rooms, and I recognized it instantly on hers. She was quiet for a long moment before she spoke, and when she did, her voice had a flatness to it I'd never heard from her before, like she was reading from something she had rehearsed decades ago and never expected to need. She told me that in the spring before I was born, she and my father had been going through a rough period in their marriage, a separation that had never become official, never become public, just a few months where they lived under the same roof and barely spoke. During that time, she told me, she had a brief relationship with a man she'd met through her work at a downtown accounting firm. His name was Richard Ashford. He was, she said, older than her, married, and by the time she realized she was pregnant, the relationship had already ended, and she had already decided that Robert Colson, whatever their troubles, was going to be my father in every way that mattered. She never told Richard. She never told Robert either, not directly, though she suspected from a few things he said over the years that he might have quietly known and chosen to love me anyway. Ashford, I repeated, because the name meant nothing to me and everything to her, based on the way she flinched slightly when she said it. Richard Ashford, she said again. He ran a real estate and development company downtown, Ashford Properties. You've probably driven past his buildings 100 times without knowing it. I had. Everyone in Cleveland had. Ashford Properties owned office towers and apartment complexes, and a stretch of revitalized riverfront that had been on the local news for years. I hadn't thought about the name Ashford since I'd read it on a construction sign, and now my mother was telling me it belonged, biologically, to me. I left her house that afternoon without any anger toward her, which surprised me later when I examined it. Mostly what I felt was a kind of vertigo, the sensation of a floor that had always seemed solid revealing itself to be a thin covering over something else entirely. I drove home slowly, taking the long way, past 2 different Ashford-branded buildings I had genuinely never noticed carried that name until that day. It took me another week to work up the nerve to search for Richard Ashford online, sitting at my kitchen table late at night after Daniel and Caleb were asleep, my laptop screen the only light in the room. What I found first was a company website, still active, still listing him as founder and chairman. What I found second, on the 3rd page of search results, was an obituary from 4 months earlier. Richard Ashford, 71, passed away peacefully at his home in Shaker Heights, surrounded by family. He was survived by his wife of 39 years, Vivian Ashford, and his son, Preston Ashford, who serves as Chief Operating Officer of Ashford Properties. The obituary was 3 paragraphs long, full of language about his contributions to the city's skyline and his devotion to his family, and it did not, of course, mention a daughter he had never known existed, conceived during a few months in the 1980s that his obituary writer clearly knew nothing about. I sat with that obituary open on my screen for a long time. My biological father was dead. I had discovered him and lost him in the same search, 4 months too late to ever have the chance to sit across from him at a table the way I'd sat across from my mother, to ask him anything, to see whether I had his eyes or his laugh, or nothing of him at all except the invisible instructions written into every one of my cells. I told myself, that night, that this was simply information now. A strange fact about my history, sad in its own way, but not something that required me to do anything at all. I had a husband, a son with a manageable diagnosis, a job I loved, a life that was already full. I didn't need a dead stranger's family, and I certainly didn't need whatever complications came with walking into a wealthy family's grief and announcing myself. I might have left it there entirely, If not for a phone call I received 3 weeks later from a woman named Diane Whitcomb, who introduced herself as an estate attorney representing the trustee of the Richard J. Ashford Revocable Trust, I almost hung up, assuming it was some kind of scam, the sort of call that preys on people who've recently taken DNA tests and might be vulnerable to a story about inheritance. But Diane Whitcomb knew things a scammer wouldn't know. She knew the exact date of my DNA test results. She knew, because the testing company's optional relative matching service had flagged a close biological match between my profile and a profile that had been quietly uploaded to the same database roughly a year earlier under an account associated with Richard Ashford himself. He tested his own DNA and uploaded it to a public relative matching database. I said, trying to understand what she was telling me. Why would he do that? Diane's voice was careful, professional, but not unkind. Mr. Ashford hired a private investigator about 18 months before he passed, looking into a rumor he'd heard, decades after the fact, that he might have a child from a relationship in the early 1980s. The investigator's search stalled for a long time. Eventually, Mr. Ashford decided to try the DNA databases himself, on the theory that if the child existed and ever tested for any reason, medical or genealogical, the system would eventually connect them. He updated his estate documents accordingly before his death to account for the possibility that this child might one day be identified. I sat down on my kitchen floor, phone pressed to my ear, back against the cabinets, and listened to a stranger explain to me that a man I had never met had spent the last year and a half of his life quietly, methodically searching for me. The provision in his revised trust, Diane explained, was specific. If a biological child was identified through DNA evidence, verified through a court-recognized process, that child would be entitled to an equal share of his personal estate alongside his son Preston, separate and apart from the operating company itself, which had its own succession structure. The personal estate, after debts, taxes, and prior bequests, was valued at just under $70 million. My share, if my claim was verified and upheld, would be roughly $35 million. I didn't say anything for so long that Diane eventually asked if I was still on the line. "I'm here," I said. "I just don't know what to do with what you just told me." "You don't have to know today," she said, "but I'd strongly recommend you retain your own attorney before you do anything else. There are people in this situation who are not going to be happy to hear from you, and I want you protected before that happens." She wasn't exaggerating. I told Daniel everything that night, all of it at once: the failed paternity match, my mother's confession, Richard Ashford's obituary, and finally Diane Whitcomb's phone call, sitting together on our bed with the door closed so Caleb wouldn't overhear anything he was too young to carry. Daniel was quiet through most of it, the particular quiet of a person doing rapid, uncomfortable math behind his eyes. When I finished, his first question wasn't about the money. It was about me. "So the man who raised you, your dad, he might have known he wasn't your biological father this whole time?" "Maybe," I said. "My mother thinks he suspected. She never confirmed it either way." Daniel exhaled slowly and put his hand over mine. "That doesn't change anything about who he was to you," he said, and in that moment I loved him fiercely for saying exactly the right thing, before either of us understood how much strain the coming months would put on that same steadiness. I found my own attorney within the week, a woman named Renata Cole, recommended by a colleague at the hospital whose sister had gone through a contested estate matter years earlier. Renata had the specific, unhurried confidence of someone who had already seen every version of a family fighting over money and was no longer capable of being shocked by any of it. In our first meeting, in a small conference room downtown, she laid out exactly what I was facing. "The trust provision is real, and it's well drafted," she said, flipping through a printed copy Diane Whitcomb's office had already sent over. "But well drafted doesn't mean uncontested. Ashford's son, Preston, runs the operating company, and Ashford's wife, Vivian, has been married to him for 39 years. Neither of them is going to want to hear that a stranger is entitled to half of a $70 million personal estate. You should expect them to challenge the paternity finding, challenge the validity of the trust amendment, and potentially challenge your mother's account of the timeline, since the affair itself, if it isn't provable independently of the DNA, could be characterized as ambiguous. Is it ambiguous? I asked. The DNA is the DNA. The DNA proves biology, Renata said. It doesn't automatically prove that Richard Ashford intended, at the time he amended his trust, for the provision to survive a serious legal challenge. We need a court-ordered, chain-of-custody verified paternity test, not just a consumer database match, and we need to be ready for them to fight every step of that process. People do not surrender $35 million gracefully, Emma, even when the paperwork says they have to. She was right, and I found that out within 2 weeks, when I received a letter from an attorney named Gregory Aldous, representing both Vivian and Preston Ashford, informing me that they intended to contest the validity of the trust amendment in probate court on the grounds that Richard Ashford's late-life decision-making had potentially been influenced by declining health and an unverified, emotionally driven belief in a relationship that had never been substantiated by anyone other than my mother's uncorroborated account. The letter used the phrase, purported biological connection, twice in 3 pages, as though 38 years of my own existence were a rumor that needed footnoting. I remember reading that letter standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd first opened Priya's message all those weeks earlier, and feeling something shift in me that hadn't been there before. Not anger exactly, not yet, but a kind of clarity. These people had never met me. They didn't know that I worked 12-hour shifts delivering other people's children into the world, that I'd spent 3 years of my own child's life navigating specialists and blood draws, and a diagnosis I still had trouble saying out loud, that I hadn't asked for any of this and would have traded every dollar of it for one real conversation with the man whose obituary I'd read alone at my kitchen table. They had decided, from a letterhead and a legal filing, that I was a threat to be managed, and they were prepared to spend a great deal of money proving it. The court-ordered paternity test happened at a certified lab downtown. 6 weeks later, everything documented, witnessed, chain of custody signed and sealed the way Renata had insisted it needed to be. The results, when they came back, were unambiguous. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Richard Ashford was my biological father, confirmed by a process no attorney on the other side could credibly attack on technical grounds. That should have ended it. It didn't. Preston Ashford requested a meeting through the attorneys, which Renata cautiously agreed to, held in a conference room at Gregory Aldous's downtown office, all glass walls and river views. I remember Preston walking in first, tall, expensively dressed, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the specific tension in his jaw of a man who had spent his entire adult life being groomed to run a company his father built, and who now had to sit across a table from a stranger who might permanently reduce the family fortune he considered, in every meaningful way, already his. Vivian Ashford came in behind him, smaller than I expected, silver-haired, wearing the kind of quiet, expensive elegance that takes decades to perfect. She did not extend her hand. "I want to be direct," Preston said once we were seated, before his attorney could even begin the meeting properly. "The DNA test proves what it proves. I'm not going to sit here and pretend otherwise. But my father was not himself in the last 2 years of his life. He was on medication for his heart. He'd had a small stroke that affected his short-term memory more than any of his doctors wanted to admit publicly, and he became fixated, in that period, on old regrets. This trust amendment came out of that fixation, not out of some considered, lifelong desire to provide for a child he'd never met. He hired an investigator 18 months before he died," I said. "He uploaded his own DNA to a public database, hoping it would eventually find me. That doesn't sound like a man who was confused. It sounds like a man who was trying very hard to fix something. Vivian spoke for the first time, her voice low and controlled in a way that reminded me, uncomfortably, of the tone doctors use when they're about to deliver very bad news gently. "You have to understand what this looks like from where we sit," she said. 39 years of marriage. I raised our son. I stood beside Richard through 3 recessions and 2 hostile takeover attempts and the deaths of his own parents. And now, 4 months after he's buried, a woman none of us has ever heard of appears with a lab report and a lawyer asking for half of what we built. "I'm not asking for anything," I said, and I meant it, in that moment, more than I had at any point since Diane Wickham's first phone call. "Your husband found me. I didn't come looking for him. I didn't even know his name until 4 months after he died. I understand this is painful for you. It's been painful for me too, in a completely different way, and I'd genuinely rather not fight about it in a conference room. But I'm also not going to pretend I don't exist because it's inconvenient for your family." The meeting ended without resolution, both attorneys exchanging the kind of careful, professional pleasantries that mean absolutely nothing, and I drove home that evening feeling wrung out in a way 12-hour hospital shifts had never made me feel. I called my closest friend from nursing school, a woman named Priscilla Young, before I even pulled out of the parking garage. Priscilla and I had worked side by side on the same unit for 6 years before she moved to a hospital across town, and she was the one person outside my immediate family I trusted enough to tell everything to, in real time, without editing myself for how it sounded. I sat in my car with the phone on speaker and told her about the glass conference room, about Vivian's hands folded so precisely in her lap, about Preston's jaw working while he talked about his father's stroke as though it explained away 18 months of deliberate searching. Priscilla listened the way she always listened, without interrupting, and when I finished she said only, "You are not going to let them make you feel like a problem to be solved, Emma. You hear me? Not you." It wasn't legal advice. It wasn't even particularly sophisticated advice. But it was exactly what I needed someone to say out loud, and I drove the rest of the way home with her voice still in my head, steadier than I had been in weeks. The pressure campaign started within days. It was subtle at first, the way these things usually are. A former colleague of mine at the hospital mentioned, almost in passing, that someone had called the nursing administration office asking pointed questions about a complaint filed against me 2 years earlier, a complaint that had been fully investigated and dismissed as unfounded at the time, but which someone was apparently now trying to resurrect. My mother received a call from a woman claiming to be a journalist working on a story about Richard Ashford's estate, asking detailed, uncomfortably specific questions about her relationship with him in the 1980s, questions that suggested the caller already knew far more than a journalist doing general research would typically know. 2 days after the letter arrived, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize while I was folding laundry in the bedroom. A man's voice, calm and unhurried in a way that felt rehearsed, told me he was a friend of the Ashford family, and that he wanted to give me a piece of advice as a courtesy before things went any further than they needed to. He said that nurses with pending complaints on file sometimes found their licenses harder to renew than they expected, especially if additional information came to light during a review. He said it might be worth considering whether the fight I was picking was really worth what it could cost me professionally. Then, before I could ask his name, the line went dead. I stood in my bedroom for a full minute with the phone still pressed to my ear, my heart going hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. And then I did the only thing that made sense to me in that moment. I called Renata and told her every word of the call as precisely as I could remember it, and then I called my carrier to confirm the call had been logged with a timestamp. Renata's voice, when I finished, had an edge to it I hadn't heard from her before. "That's witness intimidation, Emma, tied to active probate litigation," she said. "I want you to write down everything you just told me while it's fresh, and I'm filing a motion about this by end of day tomorrow." She was true to her word. The motion referenced the call explicitly, and though Gregory Aldis's office denied any knowledge of who had placed it, the filing itself became one more document in a growing pile that made the Ashfords look less like grieving family members and more like people with something to hide. Then came a letter directly to me, not through Renata, but to my home address from Gregory Aldis's office, containing a settlement offer. Vivian and Preston, it said, were prepared to offer me $2 million, a fraction of what the trust provision entitled me to, in exchange for a full and final release of all claims against the estate, and tucked into the final paragraph in language that took me 2 readings to fully parse, a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent me from ever discussing the paternity, the settlement amount, or the circumstances of my relationship, or lack of one, with Richard Ashford, publicly or privately, for the rest of my life. I brought the letter to Renata's office the next morning. She read it twice, set it down on the table, and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, something close to respect mixed with genuine anger on my behalf. "They're trying to buy your silence more than they're trying to save the money," she said. $2 million is nothing to them relative to what the trust actually entitles you to. What they're really afraid of is the story. Richard Ashford spent the last 18 months of his life quietly searching for the daughter he never knew he had, updated his will specifically to provide for her, and his family tried to erase her afterward. That's not a good look for a company that leases office space to half of downtown Cleveland. The NDA is the real ask here. "So we say no," I said. "We say no," Renata confirmed. "And we don't counter. A counteroffer signals we're negotiating a number. We're not negotiating a number. We're enforcing a valid trust provision. I won't pretend the $2 million didn't tempt me. Briefly, late one night when Caleb had a rough evening with his medication schedule and Daniel and I were both exhausted and the mortgage felt heavier than usual, and $35 million felt like an abstraction while $2 million felt like an actual, tangible relief. I sat with that temptation for about an hour on the back porch with a cup of tea going cold beside me. And then I thought about the NDA clause again, about being asked to sign away the right to ever say my own father's name out loud in exchange for a fraction of what he'd specifically, deliberately arranged for me to have, and the temptation passed. I texted Renata one word the next morning, no. Discovery, when it finally opened up through the probate proceeding, turned out to be the thing that changed everything. Renata had subpoenaed records from the private investigator Richard had hired, a retired detective named Walter Higgs who had kept meticulous notes, the kind of paper trail that made Gregory Aldis's earlier argument about a confused, declining old man impossible to sustain with a straight face. Walter Higgs's file included 11 months of correspondence with Richard Ashford, structured, detailed emails in which Richard asked pointed, coherent questions about search strategies, DNA database options, and legal precedent around unacknowledged biological children and inheritance rights. In one email, dated 14 months before his death, Richard had written a line that Renata read aloud to me in her office, her voice unusually gentle as she did it. "I don't need her to want anything from me. I only need her to know I looked." There was also, buried in Walter Higgs's file, a handwritten letter Richard had apparently drafted and never sent, found among his personal papers after his death and turned over during discovery. It was addressed to no one specifically, written in the shaky but legible handwriting of an older man, and in it he described, briefly and without excuse, the affair with my mother, his regret at never having tried harder to find out whether it had resulted in a child, and his hope that if he was ever found, or if he found her, she would understand that the searching itself had been an attempt at something like an apology, even if he never got to deliver it in person. Before any of that reached the settlement table, though, Preston sat for a formal deposition, and Renata insisted I be present in the room for it, seated a few feet behind her, close enough to watch his face while he answered questions under oath. It was held in a different conference room than the first meeting, smaller, windowless, with a court reporter set up at the end of the table and Gregory Aldous seated beside his client looking, for the first time since I'd met him, faintly uneasy. Renata began slowly, methodically, the way I imagined she always began, establishing the basic facts of Preston's role at the company, his relationship with his father, the timeline of Richard's declining health. Preston answered in short, careful sentences, clearly coached, clearly trying to give away as little as possible while still technically answering the question asked. Then Renata moved to the private investigator's file. Mr. Ashford, were you aware, prior to your father's death, that he had retained a private investigator named Walter Higgs? I was not, Preston said. Were you aware that your father had uploaded his own genetic profile to a public DNA relative matching database approximately 14 months before he died? A pause, brief but noticeable. No. Were you aware that your father revised his revocable trust 9 months before his death to include a provision for a biological child identified through DNA evidence, should one ever be found? Gregory Aldous shifted in his seat. Preston's jaw tightened, the same tension I'd noticed in the first meeting, and he said, I was aware there had been some changes to the trust. I wasn't given this specific language. Who drafted those changes? My father's estate attorney at the time, I assume. Not you. No. Renata let the silence sit for a moment before continuing, and I understood, watching her, that the silence itself was doing work, letting the room absorb the shape of what was being admitted. Mr. Ashford, isn't it true that your father discussed his search for a biological child with you directly, at least once, roughly a year before his death? Preston's eyes flicked, almost imperceptibly, toward his attorney. He mentioned something once, in passing. I didn't take it seriously. He was an old man revisiting old regrets. I didn't think it would come to anything. But it did come to something, Renata said. It came to a woman sitting in this room, whose paternity has now been confirmed through court-ordered testing at a probability of 99.99%. And your response to that confirmed fact was to instruct your attorney to characterize your father's search, conducted over 18 months, documented in detail by a licensed investigator, as the product of a confused and declining mind. Is that a fair summary, Mr. Ashford? Gregory Aldous objected, calling the question argumentative, and the court reporter noted it, and Preston didn't answer. And none of that mattered nearly as much as the look on his face in the seconds before his attorney intervened, the look of a man watching a story he had constructed for himself begin to come apart in real time, thread by thread, in front of the one person who would have the least mercy for it. Renata used both documents at the settlement conference 2 months later, laid out on the table in front of Gregory Aldous, Preston, and Vivian, along with the confirmed paternity results and a detailed timeline showing that every relevant estate document had been drafted while Richard was, according to his own treating physician's records, fully lucid and legally competent. Preston sat very still while Renata read the unsent letter aloud. Vivian looked down at her hands for the entire duration of it, and when Renata finished, the room was quiet for a long moment before Gregory Aldous asked for a short recess. They came back 40 minutes later with a different offer. Not $2 million. The full $35 million share the trust provision entitled me to, distributed according to the original schedule Diane Wickham's office had outlined months earlier. No NDA, no gag clause, only a standard mutual release covering future litigation over the same claim. Renata reviewed every page with me line by line before I signed anything, sitting in her office late on a Wednesday evening with takeout containers pushed to one side of the table because I'd insisted on understanding every clause before I put my name anywhere near it. When we finally finished, she looked up at me and said, "There's no rush now, Emma. You can sleep on it if you want." I told her I didn't need to. I'd been sleeping on it, in one form or another, for 8 months already. I signed it on a Thursday afternoon in October, 8 months almost exactly from the day I'd first opened Priya's message in my kitchen with a dish towel in my hand. Diane Whitcomb was in the room for the signing, along with Renata and a notary, and when it was finished, Diane shook my hand and said something I've thought about often since. "For what it's worth," she said, "in 11 years of doing this work, I've seen very few clients who searched as hard or as quietly as Richard did. I think he would have been glad it was you." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just thanked her and walked out of the building into an ordinary October afternoon that didn't feel in the moment nearly as momentous as it probably should have. I drove straight from that meeting to the cemetery in Shaker Heights, the first time I'd gone there since finding the obituary all those months earlier. I stood in front of Richard Ashford's headstone for a long while, reading his name carved into granite, his dates, a short line beneath them about a beloved husband and father that hadn't been updated and never would be to include me. I didn't feel angry about that. I told him, out loud, standing alone in the quiet, that I knew now. I knew he'd looked. I told him about Caleb, about the diagnosis, about the strange chain of medical necessity that had led a stranger's search to finally reach its target 4 months too late for either of us to do anything about the timing. I don't know if I believe, in any literal sense, that he could hear me, but I found, standing there, that it didn't especially matter whether he could. Saying it out loud was the thing I needed, not an audience for it. I want to be honest about what the months in between actually cost me, because it would be dishonest to make this sound like a straight line from confusion to $35 million with nothing lost along the way. Daniel and I fought more in that period than in the previous 11 years of our marriage combined, not because he resented the money or doubted me, but because the constant pressure, the calls to my job, the veiled threats through attorneys, the sheer emotional weight of grieving a father I'd never met while defending my right to have had one at all, put a strain on both of us that took real, deliberate work to repair afterward. We went to a counselor together starting that spring, not because our marriage was broken, but because I wanted to make sure it didn't become broken quietly, the way things sometimes do when you're too busy fighting one battle to notice another one starting. My mother and I also had to rebuild something in those months. I understood, eventually, why she kept the secret for 38 years. She'd made a choice. In the middle of a marriage she was fighting to save, to protect the family she already had rather than complicate it with a truth that might have unraveled everything. I don't know that I would have made a different choice in her position, though it took me time and several difficult conversations to arrive at genuine forgiveness rather than a performance of it. The conversation that actually got us there happened on a Tuesday evening in late September, a few weeks before the settlement, when I drove out to her house unannounced after a long shift and found her sitting on the back porch with a cup of tea going cold beside her, the way mine so often did that year. I sat down next to her without saying anything for a while, and eventually she spoke first. "I keep thinking about the day you were born," she said. "Your father held you before I did. He had you for almost 20 minutes in that hospital room while they were finishing up with me, and by the time they handed you back, I could already see it on his face. He wasn't going to let anything about how you got here matter to him. I used to think that meant he didn't know. Now I think it meant he decided not to know, because knowing wouldn't have changed what he wanted to do, which was love you." She looked at me then, her eyes wet in the porch light. "I should have told you sooner. Not for Richard's sake. For yours. You had a right to your own history, and I took 38 years of it away from you because I was afraid of what it would cost me." I reached over and took her hand, and we sat there for a long time without saying much else, and something that had been rigid in my chest since the day I read that obituary finally, quietly let go. I also want to say something about Daniel that I haven't said yet, because it would be easy, telling the story, to make the marriage strain sound like the whole picture, and it wasn't. There was a night, about 6 weeks before the settlement conference, when I came home from another difficult meeting with Renata and found Daniel had put Caleb to bed early and made dinner, a small, ordinary thing that felt enormous that particular week. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where, months earlier, I'd first told him everything, and he said something I've held on to ever since. "I didn't marry you because of who your father was," he said. "I married you because of the person you turned out to be raising you. None of this changes that math for me. I just need you to let me carry some of it, instead of carrying all of it alone in the car before you tell me." I hadn't realized, until he said it, how much of that year I had spent absorbing bad news by myself first, in parked cars and quiet kitchens, before I let anyone else in. I tried after that to do it differently. It made the rest of the process easier to survive, and it made the marriage that came out the other side of it stronger than the one that went in. Caleb is 7 now, stable on his treatment plan, running around a backyard that's considerably bigger than the one we had before, in a house we bought outright the spring after the settlement, in a neighborhood with better schools and a park within walking distance. I still work at the hospital 3 days a week, not because I need the income, but because I spent a long time building a career I actually love, delivering babies into the world at 3 in the morning, and $35 million didn't change how much that work means to me. On the days I'm not on shift, I've started volunteering at a free genetic counseling clinic downtown, sitting with families who are just beginning the process I went through with Caleb, families who don't yet know whether the road ahead is going to be manageable or something harder, and I find, somehow, that having stood on the other side of that uncertainty makes me better at sitting with people who are still inside it. I set up a scholarship fund in Richard Ashford's name at the Children's Hospital where Caleb was diagnosed, for families facing genetic disorders who can't afford the full panel of testing that eventually, strangely, led me to a father I never got to meet. Preston and Vivian Ashford declined to attend the small dedication ceremony last spring, and I've made a kind of peace with that too. I heard, secondhand, through someone who still works at Ashford Properties, that Preston has never once mentioned me publicly since the settlement, that the company's internal story is simply that an old dispute was resolved amicably, and I understand why he needs that version of events to be true, even if it isn't quite the whole picture. I don't need him to acknowledge me. I've stopped needing that from anyone in that family. Some weeks I think about reaching out to Preston anyway, not for reconciliation exactly, just to tell him I understand, more than he probably imagines, what it feels like to have your entire sense of your own family rearranged without warning. Then I remember that isn't my responsibility to fix, and I let the thought go, and I turn my attention back to the people who are actually in the room with me. Daniel, and I used part of the money to pay off a sister's medical debt after a car accident left her with bills that would have taken her a decade to climb out from under, and we didn't tell her where the money came from until she'd already accepted it, because we didn't want her spending weeks arguing with us about whether she deserved it. We put a significant portion into a trust for Caleb's future, structured carefully, with Renata's help, so that it will be there for him without ever becoming the kind of thing that defines who he understands himself to be. I think about that a great deal. Actually, how much of this entire story was set in motion by one family's inability to simply let money exist quietly alongside love instead of in competition with it. I didn't want that pattern repeating itself in my own house, so I've been deliberate, maybe overly deliberate, about making sure Caleb grows up understanding that what happened to his mother was about being found, first, and only secondly about what he was found with. Sometimes people ask me whether I regret taking that first DNA test, the optional add-on service I barely read before signing, the small decision that unraveled and then rebuilt my entire understanding of who I am. I don't. I think about Richard Ashford's unsent letter more than almost anything else from that whole year, that single line about only needing me to know that he looked. I think about how much of life comes down to exactly that, not the outcome. Not the money, not even the answers, but simply the fact of someone looking for you, trying to find you, refusing to let you stay unknown. He never got to say it to my face. But I know now. I know he looked. And in the end, that turned out to matter to me almost as much as the money did. I think, too, about Robert Colson more than I expected to in the months since all of this settled into something quieter. I used to worry that finding a biological father would somehow diminish the one who actually raised me, that loving one meant taking something away from the other. I don't believe that anymore. Robert Colson taught me to drive, walked me down an aisle, sat up with me through fevers and heartbreaks, and every ordinary Tuesday in between, and none of that required a shared strand of DNA to be real. Richard Ashford gave me something different, not fatherhood exactly, but proof that a person can spend the last years of his life trying, quietly and imperfectly, to make something right before it's too late. I gotta keep both of those truths. I didn't have to choose. That, in the end, might be the part of this whole story I'm most grateful for, more than the money, more than the house, more than anything a lawyer ever put in front of me to sign. That's Emma's story, and it's one of the most moving ones I've had the chance to share with you here. A DNA test that was supposed to answer one small medical question ended up answering a question she never even knew she was asking, about where she came from, and about who had quietly been looking for her all along. If this story touched you the way it touched me, please make sure you're subscribed to Kate's Fortune Stories so you never miss the next one. Give this video a like if you'd like to see more stories like Emma's, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from and what you honestly think you would have done, sitting in that first meeting, across the table from a family that had never once wanted to know you. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today, and I'll see you very soon in the next story.